Today, we're going to ask ourselves a very interesting question. We're going to talk about what Jesus said about sheep. And we're going to ask ourselves the question, am I a worshiping sheep? And we're going to talk about what Jesus said about that today and how it relates to you and me. And we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your personal Bible study. How to mark your Bible, how to think about it and meditate on it, how to apply it to your life. I'm here with my friend Sherry Mangrum, and Sherry and I are continuing in this wonderful book of the Gospel of John. We're going to see a number of very unique things today. We're going to finish the 9th chapter, and we're going to go into the 10th chapter, and you'll see why I've selected these verses to start and stop. But we're going to start at verse 35 and pick up in a story that we talked about last week, and we'll see where that goes. You ready to go, Sherry?
Yes, I'm
And
ready.
we're going to see some interesting things today and ask ourselves some very penetrating personal questions as we go here. So let's get into it. Let's read 35 to 37.
Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you."
Now, it's interesting, a couple things here. Number one, we saw this blind man was healed. Blind man from birth was healed. Went in, the Jews had all these conversations, got very frustrated with the stupid questions he was being asked, right? And
Yeah,
ultimately, the synagogue put him out and said, "We don't like what you're saying about Jesus and about us." And it's very interesting that he does not find Jesus. Jesus comes looking for him. And this is really a picture of God pursuing us in our faith. He doesn't wait for us to look for him. He comes looking for us. And he comes with a question. Did you notice the question? And up to this point, this guy is new to his relationship with Jesus. He doesn't know anything about doctrine or any of that stuff, right? He's been
right.
blind his whole life. He couldn't read, and he's an ignorant guy spiritually. Now,
Mm.
Jesus asks him, "Do
Do
you
you believe
believe
in the
in the
Son of
Son of Man?" Now, we are used to that term because we hear Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, but it's an interesting term in that no one in the New Testament calls Jesus the Son of Man. The only person that calls Jesus the Son of Man is himself. Nobody else says, "Oh, look, the Son of Man." Son of David, yes. Son of Man, no.
Didn't even think about that.
Only Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, only Jesus calls himself that. So he says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And this guy goes, "Who is he? I don't know." Now, let's go to this Son of Man thing because it's interesting where that term originates, and hearing Jesus calling himself the Son of Man would have been startling. Okay, let's
Mhm.
go to Daniel chapter 7 and look up verse 13 and 14. This is part of Daniel's prophecy about Messiah. So go ahead.
Kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His
So th-
dominion
okay.
is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed.
So when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, he's basically saying, "I'm the one that came that God gave the kingdom. I am the Messiah who God enthrones and says, 'Your kingdom will last forever.'
Yeah.
I'm the king." when he calls himself that, we go, okay, yeah, but that's an amazing prophecy that there would be one who was the Son of Man who God would make king and reign forever. Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? That's not a term that people use. The Pharisees never call somebody the Son of Man because that was for Messiah, right? So
Mm-hmm.
Jesus says, do you believe in Messiah, basically? And the man says, where is he? So I can believe in him because you're asking me to believe in him. And look what Jesus says in verse 37.
Yeah, you have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you.
So he basically says, look at me, and I'm the one talking to you. I'm the Son of Man. So somebody says, Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he claimed to be Messiah right here. And that's the king that God sets up as the co-ruler with him. Now, in 37, Jesus said to him, you have both seen him and heard him because I'm talking to you. Now, that's significant because why could this man see Jesus? Because Jesus
Healed him, exactly.
So the whole reason he could see Jesus as the Son of Man was because Jesus
Gave him
made
sight.
him see.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason we can see Christ as our Savior is if he reveals himself to us and we receive that sight. That's where we get to turn this idea of being spiritually blind. And Jesus is going to talk about that as we go here. Read verse 38.
And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him.
Now, what do you notice in that verse?
I notice that he is admitting that Jesus is the Son of Man, that he is Messiah.
He's believed, right?
And then he worships him. He bows down and worships him.
Now, what's interesting is this is the very first time in the book of John where a believer worships Jesus. All the other the woman at the well was a believer and all that stuff. Remember, Jesus at the woman at the well said, if you're going to worship me, you have to worship in spirit and truth.
Yes.
All this, all the way up to the end of chapter 9, the crowd believed him. They believe in him. They believe him, blah, 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 blah. But nowhere does it ever say they worshiped him. Now, I went into Vine's dictionary. Let's look at this. I'll show you this. It's very interesting. I went into Vine's dictionary of New Testament words and looked up what the word worship means, because this is believe in my head and then move it to the heart and revere him in my heart. This is the first time that's this idea of a believer who worships. He takes action based upon his belief. A lot of people believed and then they stopped believing because they never took it to this action of worshiping. And back in John 4:23 and 24 talks about Jesus said, you got to worship me in spirit and truth, not just going through the motions. And the word worship there comes from the Greek word that means to prostrate in homage and reverence. And it's a picture of what a dog does when the master comes home and the dog licks his hand. It's this idea of, I do total homage to you as my master. And 38 is a very big verse because it talks about a believer who responds in worship. Okay?
Yes, that's good.
Then Jesus launches into this comment to the Pharisees in verse 40. Let's look at this. Jesus said, for judgment I came into the world. He lets this guy worship him. And he says, for judgment I came into the world so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. So these people that claim that they see spiritually and everything's cool, they're blind. But people who go, I need to understand, I need to see, they get to their sight. They're healed like this man was. Then 40, those are the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?"
If you have to
And
ask.
Jesus said, "Yes, you are, you dummies." He says, if you were blind, you would have no sin. In other words, if you were spiritually unaware, you didn't have the law, you didn't have anything like a child, you didn't know the difference between right and wrong, no one could accuse you of sinning. But since you say we see, your sin remains, and you're responsible for your sin. And all of us have been told, all of us know the difference between right and wrong. We just reject it most of the time. So this idea of we are not blind too, are we? That's a great question that he's asking.
Very good question.
It's a great question to ask ourselves. This idea of we see that's self-conceit, in spiritual matters, I have a self-dependent, self-centered, I'm a sinner, where you share Christ with somebody and they go, I know everything I need to know and I'm okay. Me and God, we're buddies and I don't need to worry about anything else. You're spiritually blind. Now we're starting chapter 10.
Wow. Getting there.
With truly, truly, I say to you, chapter 10, verse 1, he who does not enter by the door. Now, Jesus switches gears, but let's listen to this. Who is Jesus talking to in chapter 10, verse 1 and on? Who's he talking to?
Pharisees.
The Pharisees who were there. He's not
Yes.
talking to the people.
No.
He's talking to the Pharisees. And he says, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, in other words, the official entrance, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. And basically what he's saying is, you guys are approaching the leadership of the sheep in a way that is not the official way God has chosen.
And they know all about official.
And that makes you thieves and robbers. Then it goes, there's three things here. Read verse 2 and 3 and look at the actions.
Okay. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him, the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out.
So it's very interesting. That's a picture of the life of Jesus. Jesus shows us the way, the correct way through the door. He calls to us to be believers. He calls and he leads us. So we can stop and ask ourselves the question, do I allow God to show me the way, the true way? Or am I like the Pharisees that say, I don't need that. I can see everything I need to see. I'm fine. He says, this is a real shepherd who enters by the door that the doorkeeper opens correctly, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own. Now notice the ownership.
Yes.
The sheep belong to the shepherd.
Yes.
Now read verse 4 through 6.
When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers.
Now I put over here, we need to be like these sheep who flee from false teachers and false doctrine that don't know Jesus.
Amen.
And we need to be like sheep who say, I'm not going to follow that guy because his voice does not resonate as the voice of Christ, who is showing me the way and calling me and leading me, as the one I belong to. He, the shepherd, puts forth all his own. He owns them, but they don't follow the voice of strangers. And go ahead and read verse 6.
This figure of speech Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he had been saying to them.
Now, I remember I was in a Bible study one time. A guy was basically saying that the Bible was really stupid and that it wasn't true. It didn't have truth in it. It was really written in a stupid way. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, this thing about Jesus being the door. Jesus is not a door. He's a human being. When he calls himself a door, what? That's stupid. And he is thinking on a physical level when Jesus is speaking on a spiritual level. That sound familiar?
Yep.
All through the book. That's what happens.
That's right.
So Jesus is speaking spiritually as himself, as a shepherd who is the door, and they miss it because they're thinking, he's a door, he's a wooden plank. I'm not getting it. And that verse, John makes the point here. This was a figure of speech.
Mm-hmm.
Look at that verse.
Yeah. Yeah.
He says again, this figure of speech, Jesus is not calling himself a door.
Of course
This
not.
was a metaphor. It's a figure of speech, but they did not understand what those things were, which he had been saying to them. They're spiritually blind and spiritually deaf for that matter. And then verse 7 is very interesting. What's the first word of verse 7? So, in other words, they were not understanding it. So he said to them, this is an explanation of what the Pharisees were not understanding. So now he's going to explain this figure of speech.
Which is
this section here.
Because they know, they lived and they know all about what shepherds do. And
yeah.
So
in fact, back in Ecclesiastes, God said, you guys, you spiritual leaders of Israel are terrible shepherds. So I'm going to bring a shepherd that will rule the people in love, and you are going to lose your shepherdness. Okay.
So it just makes me realize how much hard-hearted they were. They know what a shepherd is, but they're still wanting to not listen to him.
Yep. And he's back to this thing of, this is truth. Truly. He's basically saying, I'm telling you the truth. I am the door of the sheep. Now, let's not get hung up too much on this. This is another thing where he is claiming a relativity. I am the light. I am the living water. These are all inanimate objects that are metaphors of who he is.
Correct.
He's not water. He's not a light. He's not a door. This is a metaphor. Okay. It's a figure of speech. And he says, verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. And he'll go in and out and find pasture. In other words, I am going to be the entrance. And you can do a little Bible study over here. I've done these verses, 1 Timothy 2:5, Acts chapter 4, verse 12, John chapter 1, verse 21, that are all talking about this. He is the access to the plan God has for us. He's the door through which people can be saved. The thief comes only to steal. Now, the thief, remember, is the one who tries to come in from an unauthorized door.
Yeah.
He comes in only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. Now, we take the last half of that verse and say, oh, Jesus came to give us abundant life. But the context here, Jesus is talking about false teachers trying to take life away. But he is the authorized door, the authorized entrance, and wants to save them and give them abundant life. Read verse 11 down to verse 14.
I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me.
Now, I want to show you some little verses you can do, some studies you can do. This idea of the good shepherd lays down his life. You can go to Isaiah 63:9, Isaiah 40, verse 11, Ezekiel 34, 1 through 10, and verse 23 and 24 of Ezekiel 34. This idea of what the good shepherd does is sacrifices himself for the sheep. And when he says, I'm the good shepherd, Psalm 23, of course, is
Yes.
this idea. Now, he's saying, I care about the sheep to the point where I'm willing to die for them. You guys are just hired help. You don't care about the sheep to the point where when they are in spiritual danger, you run and you do not sacrifice yourself for the sheep. And then in verse 14, I am the good shepherd and I know my own ownership again.
Mm-hmm.
And my own know me. That's back to Ezekiel again, 34, 31. The good shepherd. In fact, flip over to that. That's an interesting verse. Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 31. There's a challenging sword drill for you. In Ezekiel 34, it's talking about the bad shepherds, and God is going to replace them with a good shepherd. And look what he says at 31, the end of that.
As for you, my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, you are men, and I am your God, declares the Lord God.
You see where he puts being a shepherd as this is the metaphor for being your God.
Mm-hmm.
And I will produce a shepherd, not like these other shepherds, but I'm going to produce a shepherd and he will be your God.
Yeah. And Ezekiel 34, 31, you can't get no plainer of an explanation than
And
that.
the Pharisees would have been very familiar with Ezekiel and this idea that's basically saying, I know my own and my own know me as God. But when he's saying this, they would have understood exactly what he's talking about. And then he goes here, he says, I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Even as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. This is the Father's plan. I put over here, this is the cross.
Yeah.
Now, when I look at this, and when he says, I know my own sheep and my own sheep know me, I wrote over here, I am his. I know him. So today we ask the question, are we worshiping sheep? We fall down the way this guy did in reverence and adoration of the shepherd who's laying down his life to save us correctly.
Yeah.
And then in verse 16 is very just interesting. It's a kind of a little side note. He says, I have other sheep. I own other sheep, which are not of this fold. In other words, he's talking about Gentile believers now.
You and me.
I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice. They will become one flock with one shepherd. They will become one flock with the Jews who believe. This is just a little aside that John is putting in as a side note that Jesus is fully aware that the Jews are going to reject him and he's going to give a message to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles who believe will become his sheep every bit as much as Jewish believers. And they're all one flock with one shepherd, Jesus. And he says, for this reason, verse 17, the Father loves me because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. This is the resurrection.
Yes.
No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up. The verse 18. So if we've heard that the Jews murdered Jesus or the Romans murdered Jesus, Jesus is making it very clear. Nobody murders me. I have the authority to lay down my life sacrificially for the sheep.
Yes. Yes.
And my death is not a tragedy. My death is the plan of the Father to bring the sheep correctly into the fold. Do you see that?
Yes.
The death was not as a result of sin. The death was a result of his authority to sacrifice himself for the sheep as the good shepherd who says, these are my sheep. I'm going to sacrifice myself for them. And then we get to the very end of this, and I want to tell you why I joined from verse 35 of chapter 9 with the blind man who was blind from birth and was healed to here, because I want you to look and notice this. It comes full circle. Read from verse 19 to verse 21.
A division occurred again among the Jews because of these words. Many of them were saying, "He has a demon and is insane. Why do you listen to him?" Others were saying, "These are not the sayings of one demon possessed."
Look up at chapter 10, verse 3. This question of, why do you listen to this guy? He is a demon.
To him, the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and
Okay.
he calls his own sheep by name.
Were the Jews hearing him?
Absolutely
No,
not.
the Jews were saying, don't listen to him. We're sheep that are not going to listen to him. Okay.
Yeah.
And still others, this others of the Jews were saying this amongst the Jews, especially the Jewish leaders who he's been talking to. Others were saying, these are not the sayings of one demon possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind, can he? So this is referring back to the sign of Messiah we talked about.
Yes.
That only the Messiah can heal a person born blind. So he basically says, how can he be a demon when he's doing these things? And this is the same kind of thing that Nicodemus said to him of, we know you're from God because nobody can do the things you do and not be. So probably these others that were believers that were saying, he doesn't have a demon. That doesn't make any spiritual sense at all.
Yeah.
Was probably Nicodemus and some others that were believing in him. And then he said this idea of, how can he? Because they refer back to this whole episode that started here with the man born blind that was back up to chapter 9, verse 1.
And I like how that's canny, like you were saying. How's found these demon possessed was supposed to do these things? Come on now. That's what we would say today. Come on now.
Yep. And then there's a break because we're going to go into next week another feast. So Jesus is still down in Jerusalem. He's still ministering. He's been ministering to the crowds. He's been ministering to the Pharisees, and he's been getting resistance. And he's been teaching in a way that they're just not hearing because they're refusing to listen on a spiritual level, and they just are listening on a physical level only. And any spiritual conclusions they make are wrong, accusing Jesus of being a demon. And we'll pick back up in verse 22 next week. Today we've been talking about worshiping the Lord as sheep who hear his voice and follow him. And I want to recommend a video to you. It's called A Reality Check on Your Worship. It's out of the first chapter of Malachi, and I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, hit the like button and the subscribe. That helps us with YouTube. And we'll continue our study in the book of John next week. And until then, God bless you.